So the next section I want to talk about is the part that faith and religion and belief and allegiances plays in the story, because the politics of Oz is a huge element of what makes the story go. It's the purpose behind it. Everything that Elphaba is dealing with that makes her wicked is in response to or caused by either her political stance or the political stance of the wizard and his regime. So when we talk about faith and religion, obviously her father, Rex Bart, is a minister, and he is a unionist minister. So as we talk about the religions of Oz, we'll just kind of start with the beginning of history. There's kind of that creation myth. And from the creation myth is that kind of paganistic belief of Lurlinism, and Lurlina, she's like the fairy godmother of the world. She discovered Oz, this emerald gem in the middle of the endless deserts. And she came down and protected it and left her daughter, the princess Ozma, to rule over it. So we've got this creation, this pagan deity of Lurlina. And so as you come to, cycle through the chapters, they have Lurlina, or Lurlinmas, I think is what they call it. It's their version of Christmas, but they're celebrating Lurlina. And the regime of the wizard actually kind of like lets it stay, because it's a capitalist holiday. They can sell, they can, it's rallying people, and they're spending money into the economy, and it's just kind of like this uplifting thing that they could use to manipulate more people, like, oh, come celebrate with us, let's have a party. But it's really based in pagan beliefs. And then they also have some other like mythos and legends that are part of that culture, and two of them are actually going to become important later. One of them being the legend of the Saint Elphaba, not Elphaba, Elphaba, and Cumbricia, the Cumbric witch, the original evil. And they tell the story of creation, how they say that Lorena came, and there was the dragon of the world, and the Cumbric witch came out, and evil spread across the land. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, because I'm not going to look it up, but there is this legend of the Cumbric witch and Saint Elphaba, which I'll get more into detail later, because it ties into Elphaba's ultimate destiny, I'll call it. So you have this pagan Lulinist belief, and then you go into unionism. Unionism is, let's just consider it monotheism, and rather than the Christian God, of Catholicism, or whatever faith that we have, the unionist God is just referred to as the unnamed God. And Elphaba is quoted saying several times, "I refuse to have faith in anything that can't be named," and that's obviously her belief there. So we have the Lurlinist pagans, and then we have the Unionists, which are the Christians. Let's call a spade, and then we have the pleasure faithers, or the faithers with a P in the beginning. And this is more about a culture of hedonism, a lack of discipline. Their belief system revolves around physical gratification, and it's the only thing really of worth. So everything you do is kind of with this end goal of pleasuring yourself, whether that's with food, whether that's with sex, whether that's with wealth, or material possessions. That's the pleasure faith. Give in to your base desire, and the rest is just kind of tedious, pointless, boring stuff. And then next to that, we have the TikTokism. And TikTokism is more of a newer faith, kind of the neo-religious alternative, because they have these TikTok machines, these little, like, one of them, Grammatic, is actually Madam Morrible's, like, sidekick, or her like, mechanical robot butler. But there are these TikTok elements. Think of them more like steampunk. The clock of the time dragon obviously kind of being a, I won't say a symbol, because it's outside of that religious belief. It exists for a wholly different purpose. But the idea of these TikTok figures kind of rolling around, kind of telling the stories, people are fascinated by it because it's new, it's shiny. It's kind of like, it's a technophile kind of like alternative to theistic faith. There's no one God. You're kind of like, let's say, worshiping technology. I don't know. But ultimately, that's one of the major beliefs that are kind of floating around Oz. So again, we've got Lurlenism, which is paganism, Unionism, which is Christianity or monotheism. You've got the pleasure faithers, which is hedonism, and then TikTokism, which is more of like a capitalism. We'll call it like that. And then the wizard's regime is actually, like, it's kind of a, I would say, he likes to tap into all of them in one way or another. He will use the name of the Princess Ozma kind of as a, let's say, like an indirect blessing of his rule, like almost like he's sanctioned to be there by Ozma, by Lurlina herself, in a way to kind of manipulate people that have that faith to say like, oh, I'm sanctioned by your god. Unionists, they're free to practice their religions and whatnot. They do eventually start being kind of cleansed out, I think. That it's not really totally explained in the book. It's just kind of like in the background. Pleasure faithing. They have actually at Shiz, there's this, they call it the Philosophy Club, which plays a big role later. But, basically it's like a sex club, call it what it is, like a cabaret, but I would say the main religious element that the wizard embraces, the state-sanctioned belief system, would be the TikTokism, because he is kind of like a symbol of capitalism, of industry, and even his, the Oz great and powerful, the machine that he uses, the talking head in the play, or when Elphaba meets him, he's like a fiery skeleton that's kind of dancing around with the wind and the rain. But these are all mechanical things that are created in order to distract from the reality that it's just this little tiny dude. And he's using it to like shock and awe, but also put fear and kind of use that fear to control. So the state-sanctioned belief system would be closer to TikTokism, with hedonism, with the pleasure faith being kind of like what people do for fun. And the TikTokism is really kind of geared towards the weak-minded people who are easily pliable and controllable. They talk about that with the Clock of the Time Dragon. People are like, yeah, we'll listen to you, Frex, but give us a chance to see it first so that we can agree with you. How can we just take your word for it? Let us see it, and then you can preach at us and tell us that it's wrong. And then it just happens, and they're absolutely like, oh, it's shiny. And they actually believe it because it's kind of telling these stories. They're like, whoa, wait a minute. Is it giving us a premonition of what's going to happen? Did that really happen? Like, all of a sudden, they're like convinced that, there's some nefarious stuff going on, and the Time Dragon is kind of using this little techno steampunk puppet show to tell the story like a play. And then we talk about Elphaba's belief in that, what she actually believes in it. And I'm just going to read from the book. This is from the chapter, The Murder and Its Afterlife. So this is after Dorothy has dropped the house. She's actually talking to, I believe, either her father or Galinda. I think it's her father. But she says, perhaps in our age, generous attempt at unionism, allowing all devotional urges, life and breath under the canopy of the unnamed God, perhaps we have sealed our own doom. Perhaps it's time to name the unnamed God, even feebly, in our own wicked image, that we may at least survive under the illusion of an authority that could care for us. So she's saying, like, why don't we just call it what it is and say thank you and trust in it? But don't leave it as this nebulous idea that kind of like sits out in the ether. For whittle away from the unnamed God anything approximating a character, and what have you got? A big hollow wind. Meaning, without a name, it's nothing. And wind may have gale force. Irony there, because Dorothy Gale, and the gale force is actually the police force, like the secret service of the wizard. And a wind may have gale force, meaning the wizard might have his army. But it may not be a moral force. And a voice in a whirlwind is a carnival barker's trick. You can discern that however you want, but basically she's saying, like, you're barking up the tree. More appealing, she now saw, for once, the old-timers' notions of paganism. This is her father, who's unionist. But she's saying, for once, she sees his pagan prehistory. Lulina, in her fairy chariot, hovering just out of sight in the clouds, ready to swoop down some millennium or other and remember who we are. The unnamed god, by virtue of its anonymity, cannot ever be suspected of a surprise visit. And would we recognize the unnamed god if it knocked on our door? It sounds vaguely familiar. If we, would we recognize Jesus if he walks among us? Sound familiar? And I think that's ultimately the kind of imagery that Gregory Maguire was trying to make with that statement. I'm really bad at reading. I only have one good working eye, and I'm dyslexic. So thank you for letting me do that. I'm not really going to edit this. I'm going to let it be what it is. You kind of got the gist of it. It's in the book, but so basically her belief is that she wants to question everything. And until she can prove something exists, then she just won't believe it's there. She can't disprove it, so she won't unbelieve it, but until she has tangible empirical evidence, she will not accept something. Like she said, I refuse to believe in something that cannot be named. So that's Elphaba's belief system. From there, I want to move into the topic of power and the weaponization of propaganda, because that's ultimately what wicked stands for. She's labeled wicked, but who called her wicked? Madam Morrible, the people, the wizard, the media. She didn't call herself wicked. She embraced that title because she couldn't get out from under it. And so ultimately, we talk about propaganda as a weapon, as a tool used to subvert any kind of reality, fake news, And with that being said, in our current political climate here in the United States, we have a major struggle with fake news, or misinformation being published on the internet, or on websites that have no credible sources, or people that just want to make stuff up because they like to stir the pot. So with that being said, propaganda is a tool that is used as a nationalist like effective tool for radicalizing people into nationalism. Nationalism is when you're so hyper zealous about where you live that you'll defend it regardless, even if it's a bad nation. Think of Nazi Germany. Those Germans, it was a nationalist attitude to join your party with all the zeal that you could muster, even if it was pure evil. And so nationalism can be a good thing if harnessed for good, but rarely is that ever the case. They say that doing stuff for this nationalist concept is considered patriotic. But on the flip side, they also say doing anything to dissent against it is considered unpatriotic. And that label of unpatriotic or wicked can really tarnish somebody's reputation and then prevent them or stand in their way when they're trying to tell people what's happening. Something is going on, but I can't tell you because you're just calling me a crazy person. And that's what ends up happening is, she has that wickedness thrust upon her and she's just kind of stuck with that reputation. Also, another form of the nationalism that is being kind of fed to the general public when Elphaba is at Shiz, because Shiz is like a college, is Madam Morrible. They kind of have like this poetry night that she has, and she ends like her little set with a poem that has the final line, "Animals should be seen, not heard." Of course, Dr. Dillamon stands up and says, "How dare you," and stamps his little hooves out. What I just said was a little bit racist against animals. But ultimately, that's what happens is he throws a fit and he leaves. And Elphaba's like, wait a minute, that's interesting that he responded that way. I wonder why. Is there something that she said or that I didn't catch in her poem that triggered him? What's the subtext? what was she really trying to say? And so she starts dissecting it. But of course, Elphaba is very outspoken, so she's going to be like, Madam Morrible, I have a question. Why did you just insult all animals? And she's like, how dare you call me out? It's just poetry, darling. And she's like, is it really poetry, or were you just preaching? Like, Madam Morrible clearly was trying to push out a message to the pliable minds, these young people who are, sympathetic to whatever kind of appeals to their emotional state. And she's trying to make them feel like, oh, you have something that you could stand up for. Do this. It's great for the nation. The wizard will love you. And so the manipulation of truth, ultimately, while Elphaba is standing in front of the crowd as well, calling Madam Morrible out for really poor taste in poetry, and a very blatant political statement against animals, Madam Morrible can spin the truth and say, oh, did you hear? Elphaba's like insane. She's following Dr. Dillamon. He's whitewashing her mind. She's being brainwashed by this animal. We need to get him away from our students. So that manipulation of the truth, that fake news, it's a political spin used to misinform the general public of what's actually happening in order to manipulate everybody into a mental state of control. Later on, leadership and control becomes a huge thing when it comes to the corruption of the government as far as the wizards regime. Because they have geopolitical goals. They really kind of ultimately, at one point, Madam Morrible brings all three of the girls, so Elphaba, Galinda, Nessarose, into a secret meeting, makes Nanny stay outside, and kind of informs them, by the way, I've charmed all of you. You're now all under a spell. You're not allowed to talk about this. In fact, you're going to forget we had this conversation. But I want you to know that I am recruiting you against your will because of your innate talent for magic to be the adepts of the different geological territories of Oz. Galinda is going to be the Glickus. Elphaba is going to be Munchkinland because she was originally supposed to inherit the title of the Eminent Throp. And then Nessarose, because she's secretly half Quadling, but also because they were raised in Quadling country while their grandfather was the Eminent Throp, she would be the adept of Quadling country. And then nobody cares about the Vinkus because it's just all frontier and those warring tribes will be handled anyway. Don't worry about it. Ultimately, that does not come to pass, but it gives us information that Madam Morrible is working with some unknown leader, which we can imply that, or it implies that it's the wizard who's kind of puppeteering these little kind of micro moves to kind of put people of power into place so that he can kind of set up puppet governments and ultimately bring everybody into his own control so that he can have access to their industry and their money and their food and their water, stuff like that. And also, it's about annexation of different territories that aren't part of his empire yet. And we learn later, obviously, like, as Nessarose is put into place as the Eminent Throp, she accidentally actually secedes because of a slight that was made at, I want to say, a funeral or a party, or there was, like, some skirmish that happened, and Nessa kind of stood up for Munchkinland and said, you know what? I don't like this. You're no longer welcome here, and kicked him out and kind of like inadvertently seceded from Oz. Hey, stop. And so ultimately, after she dies, after Dorothy drops a house, the wizard actually secretly comes in by Phoenix, bird, whatever. He secretly comes in and has a meeting with Elphaba and says, I want you to take over. Yeah, or I want you to, like, stay out of here. But if you do take over, I want your help trying to annex this back in. I want you to kind of squash all of this, political upheaval where everybody's, like, really excited to kind of be independent. Let's make that go away. And so he's, like, trying to manipulate her and bring her back into the fold. And she's like, no, we got history here, bro. You don't remember me? I threatened to kill you the next time I saw you, and here you are. And she presents to him they actually took it away from her before she went into, she's not allowed to bring anything into the meeting. So they find a page of the grimoire that she had on her, and he actually steals it and says, where did you get this? Where's the book that it came from? This is my entire reason for being in Oz. We'll talk about the grimoire in a minute. That's another section. But ultimately, we have this political, let's say, negotiations of diplomacy that the wizard is really trying to say, like, hey, why don't you come join us? I know I'm corrupt and shit, but you could benefit. And she actually says no, but then at the same time, she's like, hey, Nessa's dead. She was the Wicked Witch of the East because she had these dogmatic, religious, crazy, like, really, like, draconian beliefs that she imposed on people. And it really made them hate her. That's why they called her wicked. But she was ultimately just their governor, but they called her wicked. That's why she had that name. So now that she's dead, ding dong, the witch is dead. The witch is dead, just like in the Wizard of Oz film. That is the reputation that Nessa Rose will have for the rest of eternity. Not anything to do with why she was the way she was, who she was, or where she came from, or what she wanted, how she was trying to help. Because ultimately, the victor writes history, right? And in this case, the victor was the wizard. Inadvertently with the help of Glinda, but that's a different topic as well. On the topic of Nessa Rose, so the slippers, the ruby slippers. So in the film, the ruby slippers are ruby, and they're just ruby. In the book, there's some question about the color of them. So in the play, they start out as silver glass slippers that are created by Frexbar, the father, as a gift to Nessa Rose, his pet. And it shows favoritism. Elphaba's a little jealous, but ultimately, like, they have a conversation later, Frex and Elphaba, that he said, you don't need help standing on your own 2 feet. Speaking ironically, because in the book, she has no arms. She can't balance herself. She has to lean against somebody to stand up. In the play, the Broadway musical, she's in a wheelchair, but she has her arms. So the shoes are used as a totem to symbolize the power of the nation, because their leader had these silver shoes that when in the Broadway play, Elphaba tries to take them off and they like kind of like burn her. They're like, there's some like intuitive power that she or Nessa or Glinda, one of the three, kind of made it so that they can't ever be taken from Nessa. And the attempt to take them away kind of made them burn like fire, which is what made them red. Well, in the book, that doesn't happen. In the book, it actually says that they kind of sparkled like the fire of the universe or something like that in the big, like one of the first chapters when Elphaba is actually following Dorothy down the yellow brick road, like kind of in the epilogue. And the way they describe it is kind of, they reflected this reddish, yellow, golden illumination. They are ultimately made of glass, not of rubies. And they're made of glass that was taught, it's a glass blowing technique taught to Frexbar by Turtleheart, the quadling. And so ultimately they are a symbol of Munchkinland power and autonomy and independence, and the wizard wants them. So while on the very high level, like 2-dimensional understanding, Glinda has some motive to tell Dorothy to put the shoes on. What we learn in the book is that, well, I figured you didn't want them. You've never liked shoes. You've never been one into fashion. But when she's like, those are mine, they're my right, and Nessa said that I can have them over her dead body, like as a kind of a joke, but really saying like she can inherit them from her sister as a gift. And ultimately Glinda had to admit that it even said, I think, she's struggling to speak against her class. Like, she's trying to be real, but at the same time not choose her words poorly. She wanted to get the slippers out of Munchkinland as quickly as possible, decided to give them to Dorothy. And her argument to Glinda, or to Elphaba, was, after you abandoned your sister at Shiz, I was the one that took care of her. I was the one that told her she was special, and that what you did to her wasn't intentionally against her. I was the one that was there for her when she needed you the most. If anybody has a right to those shoes, it's me, because I enchanted them so that she could walk on her own and not need somebody for balance. That's what happened in the book. But ultimately, putting them on Dorothy's feet was to get them out of Munchkinland, because Galinda knew that the wizard was going to be making his way to the funeral of Nessarose, and that both Galinda and Elphaba would be there. And he had the audience with her, as expected, and Elphaba kind of understood, oh, that's why. But she still resented her, and she still wanted to track down this innocent girl who is, you know, kind of a bystander in the entire situation. She didn't own the house. Funny enough, little side note too, when she does eventually confront Dorothy about dropping a house on her. You parked your house on my sister. She's like, well, technically it's not my house, and it's not Auntie M's either. The bank owns it. So if you're looking for a responsible party, they are that. It's kind of stupid, but it's interesting. It's that plausible deniability, or people trying to spin the truth to get out from accountability. So with that said, the slippers are a totem of the independence of the nation, the independent nation of Munchkinland, and the wizard is trying to pull them back into the empire. So we're talking about power and the weaponization of propaganda. So she's now the Wicked Witch. We've got the Wicked Witch of the East, the Wicked Witch of the West, Galinda the Good Witch, who really is just, she's a philanthropist, really, like a socialite. She goes to parties and she dazzles people. She's married to like a guy who has like a crap title but a lot of money. And so she's just kind of like a socialite. And honestly, in the play, she really doesn't have any power. In fact, her bubble machine, when she's trying to, come down, she actually like taps on it and tells somebody above, hey, lower me down. A reference again to this TikTokism and not actually having any power. In the book, she does have power. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But then I want to talk about when it comes to control, political maneuvering and stuff like that, you really get into the politics of conversation. And one of the things before Elphaba was radicalized, when she was in Shiz, is that she navigated language very well. And against the top heads, Madam Morrible, the wizard, one of the other professors that ended up trying to do experiments on this lion cub that ended up being the cowardly lion. So, there's you can see her really trying to voice her opinion and do it in an appropriate manner, going through the proper channels, so to speak. And she finds that it's not effective, because while she may be cunning and comprehend the intricate navigation of language to have a debate and be on a dissenting point of view, she was learning that it really wasn't coming to anything. It was all rhetorical. And it really didn't fix the problem, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to change their mind because they have their own motivations behind why they believe these radical, biased, prejudiced beliefs. Because they want something. They're going to get something. Sound familiar? There's some benefit, individual, selfish benefit to them, that the greater good is no longer valuable, because then they lose on something that they see or perceive to be more valuable, and that would be personal gain or protection, honestly, in the case of Glinda. So, and ultimately, trying to talk her way into these situations wasn't working, and that's what ultimately radicalized her and made her into this activist. She's like, well, if talk is cheap, then I'll let my actions speak for me. And then the complacency of Galinda, that's the next part. So Galinda is kind of in a different, so where Elphaba chose the hard road, Galinda chose the easy road, the path of less resistance. And so does that make her good because she was a team player, that she complied to the state sanctioned beliefs, to the political alignment that she needed to project to the world in order to not be considered, an associate of this known terrorist, so to speak? Because she was with Elphaba when she threatened the wizard. And when Elphaba decided to leave Shiz, she sent Galinda home. She's like, I don't want you to have any part of this. I don't want you to know where I'm going, what I'm gonna do, nothing. Just leave. Know that I love you, but you got to protect yourself now because I'm about to go crazy. And ultimately, that was what Galinda did, and she sort of saw it as an opportunity to put herself in a position to maybe influence things for the better, or at least to stand in the way through plausible deniability of things that shouldn't be happening in only the way that she can. She obviously can't control everything, but she did end up taking that spot that Madam Morrible projected of being the adept of the Gillikin. And that is what made her Galinda the Good, because the perception, the let's say what the media told everybody was that she was Galinda the Good. They even had they said like these statues or these places that were basically like worshiping points for Saint Galinda. Like she had, like, you could go, Fiyero tried to find a statue of this girl that he fawned over in school. So Glinda ends up being to the antithesis to, or the easy path compared to what Elphaba did with being the hard path and becoming the villain. And so it kind of puts them in this position where they were friends and they loved each other, but whether or not they believed it, they were still put in position to be opposing one another. And so, of course, then we have the knowledge of what happens in the Wizard of Oz film, where Glinda the Good kind of influences things, and she's like this like light and airy, you know, ethereal character in her gown and her giant crown, the bubbles and the wand, and she speaks so affected. Whereas Elphaba is this crude, kind of militant, wearing army boots and all black with the pointed nose and the pointed chin and the hat and the cackling, and you know, so they're creating these archetypes, these characters, to make one look really, really mean and the other one look really, really sweet. And I think that ultimately that Glinda in the background is doing what she can to kind of surreptitiously interfere with what the wizard and Morrible are trying to do, but ultimately she's so caught up in her own life. In the book, she's really kind of like not, but in the play, you kind of get a feeling like the whole thank goodness scene where she's, you know, engaged to Fiyero and the crowd is singing to her, and the irony of what she's singing. There are places you go, there are bridges you cross you didn't know you crossed until you crossed. And so there's these points in her story, like they're hearing her kind of professing this treacherous journey that she's had to become this sainted character, when really what we're hearing is her lamenting the folly of her own character in order to not be tarnished, I think, by reputation. And ultimately Elphaba wants to actually like try to like, hey, do you remember that time that we sat with Madam Morrible and she cursed us and said that we were going to be doing all this stuff? And she's like, oh, honey, that was just for show. She was trying to scare us. She didn't have that kind of power. And ultimately Elphaba was like, but don't you realize it came to be? It happened. We're here. What are you doing with your part? Because obviously I'm fighting still. And so they kind of have this like falling out in the book. And ultimately, you know, the last part is like they're walking down the hall after Elphaba has just had this fight with the wizard. And he's like keeping Nor, which is Fiyero's daughter, a prisoner, a slave, in order to keep her in check, like insurance. And so she storms off because she's trying to figure out how to get Nor back and to stop the wizard from doing all this crazy shit. And Galinda is like, she like walks past her in the hallway. Finally, she just turns around and goes, oh, Elphie. And that was the last time we saw each other, because she didn't look at her. She's like, no, fuck it. You chose. You're done. And that was the end of their story together. Now, in the Broadway musical, obviously, they kind of made that a little bit more exciting.